Sorry, just letting some more people in and then we'll get started. Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is part of the DTP Business and Human Rights webinar series in conjunction with the Australian National Contact Point for Responsible Business Conduct, also known as AusNCP. My name's Kaya. I work for the Diplomacy Training Program and I'm also a law student at the University of New South Wales. Before we get into today's webinar, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. The DTP is on Bedegal country of the Eora Nation. I'd like to acknowledge all elders past and present and pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land. I'd also like to extend my respects to any First Nation and Indigenous people in attendance today. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So this series is in conjunction with AusNCP and focuses on the OECD Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct and the National Contact Points. Today's webinar will be focused on promoting human rights through the supply chain. I will give a brief introduction to each of the speakers before they go on to do their presentations. But firstly, just some housekeeping rules. Please make sure that you've muted your microphones, but feel free to keep your videos on. We are recording the meeting today. However, we will advise you in due course whether or not the recording will be shared or not. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share them in the chat at any time. We will have dedicated question time at the end of the webinar as well. We will also be sharing resources and links as we go along in the chat box as well, so feel free to keep an eye out for that as well. So our first speaker for today is John. John is one of the independent examiners of the Australian National Contact Point for Responsible Business Conduct, also called AusNCP. Independent examiners are experts contracted to the AusNCP to manage complaints against multinational companies about the OECD guidelines. John, like other examiners, manages the stages of the complaints process and is not a representative of the Australian government. On to you, John.
Thank you very much, Kaya. I'm joining from Perth in the southwest of Australia, which is Whadjuk Boodja or Noongar country, and I also wish to acknowledge the traditional owners from here and pay my respects to elders past and present. Hopefully you can see the slides, and these will be available after the presentation. And what we thought we'd do just for 5 minutes, I'll just do a very quick reminder or refresher as to what the guidelines are. So I'll run through these slides very quickly just to start with. These are the ones that we used in the earlier presentation. And if there's anything that, and I'll just cover some main points, if there's things that people want to ask more about, we can follow that up in the discussion. So just to go very quickly, to reminder that the guidelines come from a 1976 treaty. The link is there. The guidelines, I would say there's 3 important things to understand about them. First, they're a direction or they're standards to business. So the guidelines say they encourage enterprises to follow these standards. The 52 governments that have adhered or joined, accepted these guidelines, they each have to set up a thing called a national contact point. And the national contact point has a number of jobs about promoting the guidelines and and critically, and most importantly here, this third one, which is essentially, it's sort of a grievance mechanism. And I say sort of because I'll explain a little bit about how that works. So grievance about what? Today we'll be looking particularly at human rights, but the guidelines also have chapters or recommendations about companies, say, responsibilities in relation to environment or in relation to workers' rights or disclosure. So we have the guidelines. The OECD also puts out these things called guidances, which are how does this work in this particular area or field or sector? So there's a guidance about agriculture, about crops and food. There's a guidance about textiles or clothing. And with these slides, I've included links so you can click on that or go through to the document. And then there's a general, you can see up in the top left there, there's a general guidance. And I guess the essence of that is this idea of due diligence, human rights due diligence. We talked about that last time, and it'll come up again. You'll see how this works in a number of the cases about supply chains. They apply to, so 52 countries have joined this. So any company from those countries, wherever they are operating, in whatever country they operate, they're expected to comply with these guidelines. The guidelines, as I said earlier, require governments to set up these things called national contact points. And in Australia, the AusNCP, and thank you, Kaya, for doing the full title. AusNCP is the short one, has three parts to it. It sits within the Commonwealth Government Department of Treasury. So we have some Treasury staff who do a lot of the promotion, the administration work, and coherence between government departments. They have a few people who are independently contracted. So I'm one of those, an independent examiner, so that if there is a complaint, that's dealt with. It's not a government official, it's dealt with independently. And we also have a governance and advisory board. And I can see we have a couple of people in the call who are on that. And they sort of give advice and oversight, particularly to the handling of complaints. So that's the guidelines, and from last time I then talked a little bit more about this grievance mechanism or this specific instance. That's the phrase, sort of that case process. That was the very rough diagram that I included. The stages that are covered through the OECD have since updated that, so we've got a same kind of diagram. It's just looks a little crisper now, and there's the link for it. And what's the point of coming through this? Last time I said, well, coming out of this, there's I guess three things that the national contact point will do. It does have to release a public statement at the end of the process. So there's certainly public statements coming out of that. There can be action by other parties. So this can raise awareness about an issue, and there might be action by government or by other investors, other parties, and there's certainly some civil society involvement in that. So these are from a presentation by the OECD Watch, an NGO specialised in this area. So they said they're those, but most importantly, if people are wanting, okay, this needs to be rehabilitated, or there needs to be compensation, or these workers should be rehired, the only way that comes out directly from the company is if the company agrees to that process. And so again, we'll get into some cases and see how that works, but that's an important thing to remember. So we have the OECD guidelines. The AusNCP has its own procedures, which are largely the same kind of process to say what happens in each of these steps. The one thing, if you're looking at that procedures, the OECD guidelines term of good officers. In the AusNCP procedures, it's called dispute resolution, but otherwise most uses the same terminology. This table shows the various places where complaints have come up that have come to the AusNCP, sorry. And then there was a slide showing the detail of some of that. We have on our website, we have a database of all the cases and the decisions and the statements on that. So you can find that there. And last time, you remember, I went through this slide saying, here's examples. I realize this is very quick. You can get the slides later and click on that and see those statements. So there's a database for the AusNCP. There's also some good databases for all the national contact points around the world, and those links were there. OECD Watch, I mentioned before, they have some really excellent material. If you're thinking about a complaint, go to that link and think about that and use that strategically. And then the last slide I'll finish on, and as I say, it's very quick. And in the second part, I want to slow down and talk about how this works in relation to supply chains. But just, I guess, these 3 points to remember to refresh. It's not a judicial remedy mechanism, so it doesn't have an own enforcement process. The focus is on business. It's not about standards for government. It's what business should be doing. There's many factors that contribute to an outcome, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in the cases. So that's just a very quick reminder, and then I'll come back and talk in the second part about, let's look at how this operates in relation to supply chain cases. So from here, I'm happy to drive the slides for you, Laura.
Thank you so much, John. So as John mentioned, our next speaker is Laura. Laura is the Director of Strategy and Business Engagement at the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's Office. Prior to joining the office, Laura was Head of Human Rights at Woolworths, where she led the group's response to the Australian Modern Slavery Act. On to you, Laura.
Terrific. Thanks, Kaya. And before I begin, I similarly would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the land of the Gadi people of the Eora Nation, and extend my respects to elders past and present. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to join today. I've been a big fan of DTP's work for a long time. I've met many alumni in the region through the different roles I've had over the years. So I'm really, excited to be here, and equally keen for John and I and Sumita to give our updates and to get to a good Q&A session at the end. So I guess, why is the Anti-Slavery Commissioner here on this call, about the AusNCP and OECD guidelines? Hopefully over the next 15 minutes or so, it will be clear around the overlapping interests of our work. And as John mentioned, that's particularly around, some of the normative international principles and standards, particularly around due diligence requirements that sit in the OECD guidelines, that many of you will know are similar to those in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And in a way, collectively, these are the risk-based due diligence factors that businesses, certainly under the OECD guidelines, as John mentioned, are looking towards. And under the Australian Modern Slavery Act, we have a wider net of not only business but entities over that reporting threshold. So that's a little bit of the method as to why we're here today. So I'll just spend a bit of time explaining about the office and how we came about. For Australian colleagues, apologies, it might be a bit of a rehash if you've heard us speak before, but I thought it was important for our colleagues in the region who might be meeting the office for the first time. I'll then chat through some of the forthcoming debate we're expecting on law reform to the Modern Slavery Act. Again, and that's where we'll start to see the concept of due diligence coming out, and then offer some reflections around how you might all get involved. So on to the next slide, please, John. Just to introduce the Commissioner. Unfortunately, Commissioner Evans couldn't join us today, but Chris, for those of you that might know, he commenced the role in December 2024, and then many of his team came on across February and March of this year. So all in all, we're a fairly new office. Prior to being appointed as Commissioner, Chris was a senator for 20 odd years, and held ministerial roles for about 6 of those years. When he left politics, he joined the Walk Free Foundation. Again, many of you might be familiar that's the anti-slavery organisation based in Perth in Australia. In that, whilst he was at Walk Free, Chris led a number of different teams, including some time as CEO as the Global Freedom Network, which is the faith-based arm of Walk Free. So I guess with those two, with his political hat on and some time with getting subject matter expertise at Walk Free, we think that means Chris is pretty well placed in his role as Commissioner, and certainly under his 5-year term, we're hoping to get quite a bit achieved. So what that means in terms of the functions of the Commissioner's role and that of the office, and yeah, thanks, John, got the cue there. So I guess there's quite a number of things that we are. The functions of the Commissioner, so of Chris's role, are specifically mapped out in the Modern Slavery Act. So I believe there's 15 of them, and you can see a summary of them there on the left-hand side. And given the substantive I should step back a bit to say, well, what is the Modern Slavery Act for those that don't know? Effectively, the Modern Slavery Act established a reporting obligation for any entity doing business in Australia that has an annual turnover of $100 million to report on the steps they're taking to identify and take action to address modern slavery in their operations and supply chain. There's a few other mandatory criteria that go with that, including measuring the effectiveness of effectively that risk management process. So it's no surprise that some of the first three functions of the Commissioner's role is really centred on supporting those reporting entities. And there's language in there around promoting compliance to the Act. So that is, literally just getting entities that should be reporting to report. And then one around supporting those entities. So we're interpreting that as, the delivering of different forms of training material, guidance or tools that reporting entities might be able to draw on. And then the third of the 15 speaks to the office supporting sector-based and cross-sector collaborations. So the first three, they're really focusing on businesses and other reporting entities. And then a few of the other functions then touch on, obviously quite importantly, both support for and also engagement with victims, different forms of research, community outreach, information dissemination and awareness raising. And importantly, there's language around liaising with governments, and that is both federal government and then also states and local government. So kind of the liaison function is across multiple different forms of government, but then there is a specific role around advocating to the Commonwealth government as listed in those functions. So there is a lot of expectation from the sector, rightfully so, but we are a pretty small team with a big mandate. So we also think it's quite important to call out what we don't do, and the Act does explicitly say that as well, that we don't do specific case investigation. We're not a regulator. We're not law enforcement. We don't mediate any cases. As I mentioned, we're not the government, we're an independent statutory body. So that means we don't make policy, but certainly we have a position to advocate and influence any policy outcomes. And then it's also important to distinguish, certainly for stakeholders who will be familiar in Australia, that uniquely we have two anti-slavery commissioners in Australia, uniquely and quite luckily. So there's now the Federal Anti-Slavery Commissioner and the previously established Commissioner in New South Wales. So those two roles are distinct and separate. Obviously, the mandate of the New South Wales Commissioner is confined to that state. And there's quite specific differences in the functions of that role, particularly as it relates to influencing and getting quite involved in public procurement, for example. So whilst we're all of these things and not a bunch of others, really we see our role as one as advocates to provide leadership to the space and some clarity in the direction of travel. So yeah, thanks, John. Onto the strategic plan. The functions of the Act and the role also set out very quickly that we need to develop a 3-year strategic plan. So we have been in the process of doing that. I won't labour the point too much, but we did receive over 100 written submissions. And then also quite heavy involvement, I think probably more than 200 people in the end across a number of face-to-face and online consultations that we held. So obviously as a new office, we really leveraged that opportunity to meet different stakeholders and gain the insights into the development of the strategic plan. possibly of interest to practitioners on the call is we also went through a theory of change process. So in a way parallel to the consultation process, our office also ran through a theory of change, and that we have fed that into what will be the ultimate product, I suppose, that you see of the strategic plan, and then also something that remains the North Star of the office, and that will also start to underpin the annual work plans as well. So on the next slide, I tried to capture, apologies, it might be a bit small, but some of the key themes we saw coming out of the consultations. So it's no surprise, again, given the central focus of business and other entities' compliance and their role in the Modern Slavery Act, that this was one of the key topics that we saw stakeholders were most interested in our office playing a role in. And so certainly I would love to have a conversation at the end of our presentations on and how that might extend to human rights defenders and other practitioners across what effectively are key sourcing regions where Australian businesses are reporting on the types of risks that they might see in their supply chain. There was a lot of commentary around our office supporting, different forms of coordination and collaboration among stakeholders. Really strong emphasis on us being a source of guidance and accountability both towards, the state and the executive, but also from a business perspective. And of course, a real key focus on centering survivor voices, but not only centering the voices, but inclusion as a form of co-design, and also those with lived experience. We also ran a separate, or I guess another parallel consultation for the development of the strategic plan that engaged specifically with survivors and those with lived experience, end to end of that process. So there was a separate consultation. We also had a survivor advocate on the core team during the development of the strategic plan. And it really helped us as an office live this expectation of centering the voices, and it really helped shape our thinking and ultimately changed the outcome of the plan. So I'm talking about it a little bit in abstract terms because it's not quite released yet, but it will be out in the next couple of weeks or so. So we'll make sure through the right channels that you might be able to access that if of interest. But during the same period, and literally actually on the day the Commissioner started, the much anticipated response from the government on the 3-year review of the Modern Slavery Act also came out. So whilst we've been busy chatting to lots of people around our own strategy, we've been also starting to engage both with the government and different stakeholders on what the potential reform to the Modern Slavery Act based on the 3-year review known as the Macmillan Review, and also the government's response, what that might look like. So the independent review conducted by Professor Macmillan made 30 recommendations. The government's response that came out last year agreed in principle to 25 of 30 of those recommendations. I would say most were fairly light touch in terms of those that were agreed in principle, seeking to tighten or in some instances simplify some of the procedural elements of the Act. But there were a number of matters that, whilst perhaps were agreed in principle, were also suggested for further consultation. And on the next slide there, you'll be able to see that the Attorney General's Department, who is the government department responsible for the consultation and indeed responsible for the ownership of the Modern Slavery Act, they have divided this consultation process into Stream A and Stream B. And you can see very recently on the 1st of September there that the input into the Stream A consultations from a written perspective has now closed. But from our conversations, particularly with business and certainly civil society, a lot in that Stream A column there were, again, fairly uncontroversial topics. But I did want to draw out some interesting points for those on the call that might give rise to certainly more nuanced approaches from companies, and that is, should they, just back on the previous slide, sorry, John, should they be, whilst they go into consultation, should they be agreed and updated, I think will be quite interesting. And that is around some of the proposals in the mandatory criteria. There's some suggestions that the criteria for what companies need to report on might be updated to include their reporting on grievance mechanisms, be that grievance mechanisms that they own themselves or participate in. And I think the or participate in piece is of interest, particularly for where we see effective mechanisms in high-risk contexts, again, in high-risk supply chains in the region. The second piece was around processes and actions to remediate modern slavery incidences. So whilst it's perhaps implied already in the government guidance, there's a move to make this a more concrete requirement of what companies need to report on. So I would expect to see, should that be introduced, quite an uplift in the sophistication of how companies go about remediating instances of forced labour or other severe forms of worker exploitation. And perhaps most crucially, or where I see a lot of opportunity for those on the call, is the proposal to include a requirement of engagement. The current language is just of internal and external stakeholders, that is business and human rights practitioners. We know that there's quite good language both in the UN Guiding Principles and also the OECD guidelines around meaningful engagement with potentially affected stakeholders. And I would imagine for most businesses that are already aligning to these international standards, that in part this is how they may interpret such a requirement. So we know too from conversations already with Australian business that there's been quite a lot of momentum, I would say, over the past 2 or 3 years. And if there's any Attorney General's colleagues on the call, I think particularly since the anti-slavery forum that I believe was in 2023, where this concept of really centering survivors and those with lived experience was really brought to the fore for stakeholders in Australia. And since then, I have seen a lot of interest and momentum for business. So I think there might be an interesting conversation we can have around, well, what does that actually look like in the region in some of those key supply chain areas. Thanks, John. Yes, on Stream B, there are 2 matters that will go to consultation. And the first one that sorry, John, I'm jumping all over the place, but matters of high risk declaration and also due diligence. If we pop to high risk declarations on the next slide, effectively, this was a proposal that came out in the independent review, which is the idea that the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, so our office, or the government might make a declaration of different matters, and it's kind of been described as, be it a location, an industry, a product, a supplier or supply chain that has a high risk of modern slavery. We don't know much more about what the potential for this might look, but certainly we're thinking of it that this is something that there's quite a number of options for what that could look like. And you can see we've just popped down what we think are some of the considerations that might go to consultation. So, certainly it would be a conversation around, well, what's the purpose of a declaration or a list? Is it just to give greater awareness to the risk-based efforts of companies? Is it tied to reporting? Is it tied to a requirement for due diligence? Does that declaration come with additional specific guidance? Does it come with a multi-sectorial group? There's lots of ways that you could think about making such a mechanism effective. And And, I think, again, trying to speak to those who are on the call, there is a role here, or a potential role for civil society in helping to identify the types of information that will help sharpen our collective focus on what, where should we be putting our attention. We know that risk changes all the time, that sometimes even doing an annual risk assessment isn't enough to keep up with certainly the changing nature of supply chains, particularly in this environment. Conscious of time, so I'll just go to my last slide. Thanks, John, which is this question of the potential around a due diligence requirement. Like I mentioned, this is where some of the thinking and the work of AusNCP, certainly with their mandate to promote the OECD guidelines, overlaps with our interest, and the broader business and human rights space around due diligence. So we have seen under the past 6 years of companies reporting under the Act that certainly top ASX, or ASX being Australian Stock Exchange companies, all leading businesses, are referring to either the UN Guiding Principles or the OECD guidelines as the basis of how their organisations are thinking about their risk assessment. So they're adopting the due diligence principles that are considered the normative standards. So whilst we see a lot of companies doing that already, they're identifying their risks and prioritising action and putting systems in place, that this is probably the leading cohort of companies, and there's quite some work to do to close the gap for others. And we particularly see companies that are business to consumer facing, so household names are probably doing this slightly better than companies that might be either privately owned or selling business, what we would call business to business. So the conversation around the potential for some due diligence requirements, isn't in isolation for Australia. We know that there's conversations going on in Europe, the UK, and quite a bit of activity in the region, I think with maybe Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, either themselves discussing or having already drafted similar types of requirements. So we would certainly be keen to hear from anyone on the call that has had experience in those other jurisdictions as well. So in closing, like I said, very excited for the Q&A. Some things that are on my mind and I'd be really interested to hear around from you is how might you see either the high-risk declarations or a requirement for due diligence playing out in your work? Do you think that this would add value on the ground to what you're trying to achieve, or not? Because, policy as well needs to be informed by lots of different stakeholders, but particularly in the areas where they are intended to have the most impact. So I'll park there and hand back to Kaya, but keen to get into the conversation at the end. Thanks, Kaya.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I believe we're back on to you, John, for the next part of your presentation. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now people can see I can slow down. So I want to take a bit of time to talk about some of the cases that NCPs have had in relation to supply chains and human rights issues. And I'm going to start and finish with this slide because I think it's useful to sort of think about the categories, the types of cases that come up. And so most people will be sort of familiar with the idea that it might be focused on the responsibilities of the company. And the question is often of the company, well, where are you getting that material from, and what are the conditions in the suppliers? And so we see a number of cases that are looking at what has the company done in its human rights due diligence to understand the risks and the impacts from where it's getting its product from. And equally also, if that company, say, is a bank and it's lending money to a client, it has responsibilities as well to make sure that its products or its services are not being used and causing human rights impacts. So there's a number of cases that look at those relationships there. And then there's two other very broad categories, I'd say. One is the concept of service providers. So these are what Laura was talking about, business to business. So often companies might say, oh, we'll get a monitor or a social auditor to check, and then we can say we're happy with everything. Well, there's some cases there saying that needs to be, that can be useful, but it has to be a proper process. It can't just be tick a box and you're done. So there's some interesting cases there about service providers. There's many cases about subsidiaries, so where a company invests or has shares in another another business, or they have a business in another country that's doing work. And so we're seeing a lot of the cases talking about there that main company needs to sometimes address impacts on communities and workers that are occurring through its subsidiaries, and it has to encourage its business relations to follow the guidelines. So there are very four general categories to think about some of these cases. And then the last one is there's a couple of cases where it's seen during the process, then that's sort of brought in other stakeholders or other or government in one case I'll talk about. So they are broad categories that help us sort of think about this, and I'll finish on that slide as well. But what I want to do for the sort of the remainder of this this session, and then we can pick it up in question and answer, is to look at some of these cases. So remember, this is the process that the cases go through, and I think there's three interesting things to look at. One, the cases where there has been some agreement, where through the process there was a mediation engagement, and the company has come to remedy or to address some of the concerns that were raised. So I'll look at some cases where there's been agreement through the NCP process. Also important though, there's a number of cases where there has been agreement outside of the NCP process. So the complaint's been lodged, and that may have been the impetus for the company then to say, okay, we'll address that. So I'll look at two groups there where there's been some agreement and action directly by the company, but the majority of the cases are ones where the company hasn't done something, and so it's gone through the process, and the national contact point has then made perhaps some observations, a statement about the company compliance, or made recommendations about what business should do to better respect these guidelines. So there's four groups I want to look at. Don't worry about this next slide. You won't be able to read anything on it. But I want to pick those up and look at a couple of these cases. As I said, the slides will come later, and for each of these, if you click on the link, I've tried as best I can to give the particular page or paragraph number if you want to see exactly what I'm summarizing here. So we see some cases where the company has agreed to pay compensation or a contribution to address the impact that was raised. And often that will come with a statement that the company says, we're not legally responsible, but we want to make this payment. And we can see a couple of cases that talk about that. There've been others where they've encouraged and arranged for the subsidiary to rehire workers. That was the issue that was raised in the complaint. There've also been many where through the process, the company has agreed either it has already or it will make some changes, perhaps in its policy or its procedures, to address these issues raised in the guidelines. And you can see a couple of examples there: procedures about operating in conflict areas, amending policies to give greater recognition to Indigenous rights. Sometimes it's quite specific. Sometimes where there's agreement, the agreement is confidential, and so we don't have a lot of information about it. So the third one there, the wording, the agreement was that the company intends to strengthen Indigenous rights in its own business context, suppliers and clients. That's a recent case from the German contact point. So you can see the statement. That's encouraging, but it's a little hard to know exactly what that involved. So there's an example of some of these cases where there've been agreement through the process. The next thing I want to talk about, which I think is important to bear in mind, is sometimes there can be benefits that come outside of the NCP process. And often these cases might be overlooked because they might say, oh, nothing came out of the case, or the NCP statement, was inconclusive. But there have been a number of cases, again, where payment has been made or contribution has been made outside of the NCP process or during the NCP process. Sometimes the company has directly remedied the matter after the complaint's been lodged, either entirely, and you can see a couple of cases there where the company's just, say, refunded or paid back the money that was contested, or partially. So that first case there, the GBR, the UK contact point, was a case in relation to questions of mining of a subsidiary in Africa. And at the end of the day, the contact point statement said, well, we find this company wasn't acting consistently with the guidelines. But also in the statement, you see earlier, as soon as the complaint was lodged, the company sort of addressed one of the water issues. So we can see in some instances that the lodging of a complaint has led to some efforts to remediate or address the impact. So there's two broad things of where we've seen agreement or the company addressing it, and I'm happy to talk about those in further detail. But let's look at situations where the company hasn't remedied it, it's gone through the process, and the national contact point has made observations. And there's two bits I want to see in this. There's a lot of cases where the contact point statement has said the company here has not been consistent with the guidelines, or sometimes they'll say they're in breach or hasn't followed the guidelines. But it's also important, there are a number of cases where the national contact point has looked at it and said, well, in this conduct that's being complained about, the company did do enough to meet the guidelines and acted properly. And it's important to know those cases and look at them as well, because they can act as a very good precedent and guide as to what's expected. So to start first with where the company's been seen to be inconsistent, a lot of this is about those questions of due diligence. Have companies acted sufficiently when they've been aware of information? Have they disclosed properly and engaged properly with communities? And there have been a number of cases where the contact points have made a statement to say, well, look, in this instance, the company didn't do enough, whether it's about impacts itself, whether it's in relation to subsidiaries. One there, again, just relying on if it's a government export, if the government said we can export it, then we assume it was okay. The contact point says, well, that's not enough. You've got to do more for due diligence. And particularly if it's publicly known, the areas that you're dealing with have higher risks, then more is expected of the company in response to that. And then the last group of cases there where they haven't used leverage. So it said, okay, you're not responsible because it might be a subsidiary or a business relationship, but you have to be encouraging that business relationship to be improving the situation. So there's some interesting cases there. Then there's these cases where the contact point has looked at it and said, well, actually what the company did there was sufficient. There's three I've picked up here. One's an old one of the Dutch contact point. So this was a financier that was connected a long way down the track with some impacts, but the lending agency did ask questions and do sufficient for due diligence. The second one is the Norwegian telecommunications company Telenor, and some of a subsidiary's infrastructure in Myanmar was used by the army to attack civilians. And again, the contact point looked at this in detail and said, well, they did do sufficient due diligence for the threats that were known there. So it's important to look at these cases because they can give some useful guidance. And then the last group of cases, sometimes the NCP might not phrase it as this company has done something wrong, but they'll say, here's a recommendation to comply with the guidelines. And we can get some really useful ideas out of that. So that the first one, a case from the Dutch contact point about a company who made anesthetics, and that was then being used for executions in the US. And the company said, well, look, that's a long way down the track. That's our customer. We can't control it. And the contact point said, if once you're aware of these impacts, you need to be doing something about that. The second one, a recent AusNCP case where the company said, well, if there's impacts on this Indigenous group and we need, and free prior informed consent wasn't given, well, we'll look at remedying that. We'll pay compensation. So compensation cannot be used just as we didn't get consent, therefore we'll remedy it. That's not how the guidelines work. And then again, a number about can't rely on auditing. You need to use leverage. A really interesting one, that second last one, the Italian contact point. This was a construction company that was working for a state-owned entity in Ethiopia. And they said, oh, here's our detailed procedures about addressing impacts and control. And the contact point said, that's good, but you need to make sure that you've provided all the necessary support for that to occur. So that's a good case as well, to remind companies you can't just have the procedure and the policy. You need to make sure that that's being actioned in reality. So there, very quickly, and in Q&A, I'm happy to pick up some of these, but I guess just I'll finish with this slide, just going back to this is perhaps a useful way to think about how the guidelines are relevant, how they can be used. So focusing on engagement with other parties. And I'll stop there. When you get the slides, you'll see the next 3 pages have all in case any of the links crash, I've included the full details of the references there. And then the last slide has links to the AusNCP, to our procedures, and to the OECD guidelines. And I'll stop there. Very happy to pick up any questions in the subsequent discussion. Thanks, Kaya.
Thank you so much, John. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Sumita to the call. So Sumita is a DTP alumna, trainer, and is the founding director of Our Journey, a civil society organisation advocating for an internationally compliant migration system and migrant rights in Malaysia. Sumita is the chairperson of Migrant Forum in Asia, MFA, DTP's key partner in Asia, driving migrant rights advocacy initiatives globally with memberships across 22 countries in Asia. So I'll invite Sumita to share her response and her reflections drawing on her experience. Thank you, Sumita.
Thank you. So just an amendment, I'm the former chair of Migrant Forum in Asia. I just finished my term with Migrant Forum Asia. So, I mean, the presentations were very, very interesting. And I think the most important part here for me would be the voice of the migrant in the whole process. So if you look at a lot of complaints mechanisms that are in existence, the migrant is not able to access that mechanism. He or she always has to depend on someone else to access that grievance mechanism. So for me, making it more accessible for migrants would mean that the migrant worker themselves being able to maneuver the system without the assistance of anyone else. So having it in multiple languages, having it in simple language, and also a form or even as many avenues as possible for the worker to raise issues will be the best way forward. Not just an email or not just coming in person, but many ways. Because workers, we feel that sometimes don't have the ability to write. They can speak, maybe they can't write. They don't know how to convey their problems. So having a mechanism where the workers can have many avenues to complain will be good. Secondly, I think empowering the worker is key. Even before the complaint mechanism, empowering worker about what their rights, about how to use the mechanism, and if they have an issue, how to go about it. So empowerment of worker on that issue is also very, very, very crucial. Of course, we always see often migrants. There are migrants who want to use human rights defenders, civil society, trade unions to help them to maneuver the system, to raise complaints. So in this kind of situation, I would say that the civil society or the human rights defender or even the trade union should have some sort of training, not only about the complaints mechanism, but also about case management, about communication skills, and also listening skills. most often when we have migrants coming to us, or even workers coming to us of issues that they have, we want the worker to tell us the issue, but then we also want the workers to tell us what they want out of the process. It's better that we lay out all the possibilities that they have, but then allow them to choose what they want. For example, there will be migrants that or workers come and tell you that I don't want to go through the system. I just want to go home. And so that should be the case. You can't force someone to go into the system if they don't want to, because they might have any other issues surrounding their issues. So it's better to listen what the migrant wants, and then or the worker wants, and act according to that. The company grievance mechanism is one, and the grievance mechanism that was presented by John and the other speaker is another thing. But is for me is whether how far the system can actually change the violations that are happening in the company itself, or is it just like, or will the company just take that particular problem as just an isolated problem? So this is what we see happening a lot of times. So if there's one problem that comes up in the company, maybe or something on wages or anything, then the company and the authorities will tend to isolate that problem and say, well, this is just a one-off problem in that company. It's not an industrial practice. It's not an industrial problem. So we don't have to make any changes. So how much can the agency take that problem and try to create a better practice for the industry? I think that's what we need to go. We need to go through that kind of thought process. Just because one worker complains and no other worker complains doesn't mean that it's not systematic. It really takes a lot for the worker to come forward and to make a complaint. And there are a lot of workers who will just stomach the problem and just go with the flow, and endure the violations. So, but then it's better to look at the problem that is more systematic. It's not just a one-off thing. So these are things I think the system can, the changes that can bring, that the agency can bring to the changes that we want to see. Of course, it's a new process, but I think moving forward, these are things that they can do. And also, I feel that the agency can also help the companies in recommending changes, because a lot of times, like example, when we have audits being done for companies, usually the auditors will just tell them all the problems that they have, but then the companies don't know how to go about resolving the issue. So it takes a long time for them to resolve the issue, because if they knew how to do it, the problem wouldn't have been there from the start. So I think the one part of it would also be how to recommend changes and how to put systems right. Not just having a complaint mechanism which is penal in nature. Yeah. So yeah, this is my reflections for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sumita. So we do have some time for questions and reflections now. So I have prepared some questions. I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat yet, but please feel free to add any sort of questions or comments, and I'm happy to direct them towards the panel or a specific speaker. So looking at the questions I have prepared, this is to whoever feels comfortable answering this, and it's directed towards everyone. What advice can you give to any human rights defenders seeking to lodge a complaint, and where could they start off, or where could they start with seeking support from?
I'm happy to have a first go at that, and others can join in. And I think some of this, listening to the really important points Sumita was making, reinforces that. The first thing I'd say is look at the company itself, because the UNGPs encourage companies to say, you should have your own grievance mechanism there first with. It shouldn't be, the first port of call shouldn't be, I want to go and look at an NCP. It should be, what does the company do? What does the company have in place to deal with concerns and issues and grievances? And we see this reinforced in a number of national contact point statements where they say, the company doesn't have an effective grievance mechanism in place. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. So that's the first place I'd be saying to start with. The second, I think, is, I completely understand the difficulties of access and understanding the procedures, but where there is some form of regulatory control, whether in the country that you're in or a host country, sorry, a home country of a company, say the modern slavery laws that Laura was talking about, if there's a law and a regulatory arrangement in process, again, that can sometimes have a bit more teeth and specific engagement with that. If there isn't one, or the one that's there is not consistent with the international standards, that's when I'd say, okay, perhaps you can get some use out of the OECD guidelines, and the materials from OECD Watch, I just can't emphasize enough how useful they are to think about the strategy of what it is that you're wanting to raise.
Can I just add as well?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add that, like what John said, there are many avenues to seek redress. So there's also judicial and also non-judicial avenues. Example, there'll be also negotiations with employers as well. So that depending on the case. But I feel that human rights defenders, you need to be able to inform the migrant of all the possibilities that they have, and then allow the migrant to decide which avenue they want to go for. And also to keep in mind that migrants and workers, they may need other forms of support, example, shelter, food, medical, so on and so forth. So it'll be good for the human rights defender to have to grow their network with other providers like shelter providers, humanitarian aid providers, medical health clinics, places of worship. All these people can give the additional support that the worker needs. And also the human rights defenders must have sound knowledge of the applicable laws and policies, because empathy alone and on human rights and human rights belief will not be able to win the case. So you need to make sure that you have the applicable laws and policy and you know about it. Also, of course, you must do your homework on the case. You need to collect evidence and also do an analysis of the case, ensure it is a case that is worth bringing it up to the agency or even to the company. Sometimes it may be just misunderstanding, so it's good to do your own analysis. And also to double confirm the allegation. So like when we get a case, we may try to see whether the company has previous cases in reported, or if there's other workers that are going through, how to cross-check their allegation. These are things that will help the human rights defenders case. And finally, I think it will be good to be realistic on the time, cost, and also expectation of the case. One thing that we always do is that not to overpromise to the worker that this can be done. So I think these are things I think the human rights defenders must keep in mind. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sumita. We just had a question come through from Crystal in the Q&A box. I don't know if all the speakers got it, but I'll just speak it out. So considering that there has been increased trust issues between complainants and these processes, given that there has been sort of ongoing and historic violation by such multinational companies, specifically in countries like the Congo, for example, how can we sort of build this trust back up again and have trust in these mechanisms for these complainants? And this is directed to whoever feels comfortable answering this.
Well, I can certainly, if these mechanisms means the OECD guidelines and the national contact point, go to the databases and have a look. There have been many cases about Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and companies that have connections there, and also in relation to links into Palestine, or the use of products in the Middle East as well. So there've been a number of cases where companies have been questioned about their actions there. So there's some very good precedents to look at there. I guess part of the issue, and gets back to that point I said at the start, the national contact point and the OECD guidelines is not a judicial remedy mechanism of itself. So it's not something that can say, okay, this can provide compensation. Where the company can engage or wishes to engage, and there can be engagement, there have been, and I gave some examples of useful outcomes there. But if the company doesn't, all you get through the national contact point process is a statement of consistency or not. And then this is one thing that potentially may be relevant to be used in other processes, whether it's law reform, whether it's issues of engaging with other government departments or with financiers. So it has a relevance, but you need to be very clear in your understanding of what the guidelines are about. They're focused on companies' expectations. So unfortunately, sometimes we see complaints, oh, the government hasn't done this. And you go, well, that may be the case, but this is not the forum that looks at government responsibilities.
Thank you so much, John. Just sort of continuing on from your response, and this is a question for Sumita. In your experience, when there has been some sort of resolve or these companies have gone through an NCP process and there has been some sort of solution found, what are the changes that were made on the ground, and how did they sort of get implemented, and how can other agencies, for example, such as the Anti-Slavery Commission or local agencies, sort of assist with that process of implementation and betterment?
I think, to be honest, I wouldn't say that there has been successful outcome has led to change in holistic change in processes. I think that has not happened in a lot of cases. But I think in the absence of extreme violations of labor and human rights of workers, the idea should be to find a win-win situation for the companies and the workers. And any complaint mechanisms that should not be penal in nature, like what I said just now, it should not be penal in nature, because the companies also must be given the tools and assistance to change their management of workers. So if you're looking at from an Asian point of view, many of the internal policies of the companies and also the practices that they have are inherited through the company, or even the industry. So what looks acceptable before may not be so now in this time and era. So, but the company usually would not make changes unless they see the problem or the problem is presented to them. So periodically reviewing company policies and also keeping updated on the workers' issues in their country of origin and destination would also allow companies to better manage the situation that they arise. So when it comes to successful outcomes, this is the fear I always have, because when we see a successful company, it does not translate to industrial change. So that's something that needs to be looked at. So how can that one particular successful outcome change the industrial practice? How can auditing also take into consideration that successful outcome and also look for some of the changes that they can do in the relevant companies. So agencies can also make this as a best practice to change their guidelines to incorporate some of the successful outcomes from these cases. So I mean, it's an ongoing process. It's not cast in stone. So even guidelines should change according to to the trends at present. What is the violations that are happening? What are the best practices that the companies have? How to incorporate them? So I think these are the ways forward in terms of making to see the changes on the ground.
Thank you so much, Sumita. So my next question is for Laura. Since the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's Office is quite new, does that sort of allow the office a bit more flexibility in assisting a dialogue between both companies as well as complainants and survivors engagement?
Sorry, just finding my mute button. Thanks for the question, Kaya. Maybe for a moment before I get to that, just reflecting on some of the other questions and commentary, maybe bringing a few threads together. I think on the point of grievance mechanisms that John was talking to and what Sumita has also just touched on there, I do think there's an interesting role for industry-based groups in the conversation. So whilst it might be more mature sectors or companies that are in those groups, and it might not be necessarily where the violation is occurring, what you might find is that I guess companies at the top of the supply chain, or the bigger companies, or the companies that have quite high levels of human rights literacy and forward-looking commitments, they are the type of companies that will be in different industry groups. So that might be the Seafood Task Force, for example, or palm oil companies under the Consumer Goods Forum coming together and have a group. There's lots of different industry groups in the region. Sumita might, and you all might have comments on their effectiveness. So equally, very happy to be called out if there's also elements that aren't effective. But I think just to note that they do exist. And companies under certainly under the UN Guiding Principles, John, correct me if it's also in OECD Guidelines, are tasked with this idea of increasing their leverage to have a positive impact on human rights in the supply chain. So it just strikes me that there is an opportunity there that, and I think to the comment around, trust in the grievance mechanism, there's probably a step before that around trust in the ecosystem. And so if we can start creating more opportunities, be it one-on-one with companies, but, probably we'll have more success at scale through things like these different industry forms of associations, then there's just different ways to build trust and bring forward, different grievances or issues as they arise. To the question of the office and the opportunity for dialogue, I would go to some of my earlier points that, we don't have a formal role in, if it's kind of dialogue from a, mediation of issue sense, we can't take on cases. So probably where I would see us having a facilitatory role in what I'm calling the ecosystem, it's we're really keen to bring groups together that might not otherwise have the chance to do that. I saw earlier on the call, although he might be off now, we did have Dan from the UN Global Compact on Australia on the call. Obviously, DTP has a big network, and I think there's ways now that we can start thinking about, has Dan's business group ever met with, the folk on this call, or what are the different ways that we can get human rights defenders in front of business practitioners in leading businesses just to talk about some of the challenges. And I just see some interesting opportunities that our office also might have a role to play, but in terms of a formal dialogue, that sits in other systems.
Thank you so much, Laura. And just wanted to tell everyone that if you feel more confident speaking your question, you're more than welcome to just raise your hand and I can unmute your microphone for you to ask your question. My next question is, actually, we've just had someone put their hand up. Give me 2 seconds.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So sorry. My name is Samuel. I'm from Indonesia. So I think I'm working closely also with my country government on that focus here, especially on due diligence as well as human rights instruments. I just want to ask, when we're talking about this issue, we always I think we need to understand that it's also about the consumer's role. People demand green labeling of the products, but not all of them really demand for business human rights labeling on the product. So, if any of the speaker can address the greater consumer's role, so aside from the government's implementing policies to oblige the businesses, I believe it's also important to start it from the from the demand side of the issue. So how can people really start to take ownership and start demanding? I mean, I've been talking with some of the government institutions also here, like Ministry of Human Rights, like why this is still a voluntary measure in Indonesia. I mean, if you want for this due diligence to be done effectively, you need to do it in a more mandatory basis. But then they said, oh yeah, they already have ESG, and some of the companies are also more comfortable at doing the BHR thing under the ESG reporting that they are doing, because they said, okay, we don't want to duplicate our submission, things like that. So yeah, I mean, companies will start respecting and cleaning up their value chain from human rights violations once the consumer is voicing their concerns about it. So yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Samuel. Kaya, if I've got a couple of points I could say
No, go ahead,
in
John.
response to that. Yeah, really important issue. The consumer and the material and the information that's available to the consumer is important. So the guidelines, yes, it has a chapter on human rights. It also has a chapter on disclosure, and it has a chapter on consumer interests. And there've been a number of cases. So in the first one where I said agreements had come out, the final one, there was a Polish case. This was an interesting case against a Polish sort of internet provider. And the question was, you're getting advertising fee from companies who are putting up material that's not accurate about environmental impacts. And coming out of that process, the company agreed with the complainant about putting in place a monitoring system so that where incorrect information was being made available, that would be taken off the website. So, I mean, it's a small example, but there are a number of cases where companies essentially, fine, you can make the claim, but you need to be able to show the basis on which you are saying that's environmentally friendly, or it's got ethical sourcing conduct. And here's where there's going to be an interesting interplay between modern slavery reporting. So if a company puts up here's our modern slavery report, and we've checked everything and everything's great, and that looks beautiful, and we've filled that in, but they actually haven't done the due diligence, haven't done the auditing, don't have the information to back that statement up, that may comply with the regulatory system in some countries because they've said all you have to do is put in the report. But they're potentially open there to a question under the OECD guidelines, because that merely making that statement isn't sufficient due diligence.
Happy to build on that, Kai, very briefly. I think it's a really pertinent question, Samuel, and thanks for it. I think, we're always up against the consumer, and there's some interesting research. I will have to speak vaguely because I don't remember it in detail, but I think essentially also there's a lot of goodwill and sentiment in theory from consumers, but when you then translate to their actual purchasing behavior, whilst they might express a desire to shop fair trade or ethical or more green, the actual reality of the purchasing also doesn't marry up with their aspiration or their values of how they want to shop. So there's a kind of another interesting element with the consumer of how they think those show up in the world and how they purchase in reality as well. And I think just one comment briefly on, I guess, a little bit of what John said around the claims. Certainly in Australia, there's a lot more focus now on being really able to verify the claim, rightfully so, whether it's a green claim or an ethical claim or a human rights claim on the product. So I think we're seeing companies be more cautious perhaps as a result as to what they say, albeit, the caution is welcome because it's also driving more specificity. You can't really say you're sustainable anymore or you're green. That there's you need to be more specific than that. So I think it's a great question, but a really tough one to answer when there's a lot of demand on consumers as well.
Thank you so much, Laura. And Sumitha, do you have any thoughts or comments on this question as well?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And I think the consumer role is very, very important. And we have seen how consumers can actually change, how products are being made, where is it being sourced and things like that. But there's also, I think there's more, how do you say, publicity on green labeling. Rather than human rights labeling, maybe also because if you see in the context of Asia, I think the problem we have is also, like example, in Malaysia, almost 90% of our workers in the plantation sector are migrant workers. But we also have a very strong anti-migrant sentiment in the country. So we don't, the consumers don't want to know about, or rather will say that the workers are not supposed to be here, or we don't really care about the welfare of the workers because they are foreigners, but then they need the product. So I think that's where we have not actually bridged that gap on how to change the role, how to change this xenophobic tendency, and also how to address the anti-sentiment, because it also comes from politicians, it also comes from media. A lot of people have that kind of sentiment. So it's I think the changing of society, but it's taking time. It's really taking time. We do see certain sectors when there is some reporting of violence against, like, maybe domestic workers. Then we see some sort of a support for the migrant. But when it comes to products, I think they have not related that the product to the how do you say, to the um work of the migrant. They don't see that the migrant is actually producing the product. They just see the company is producing the product, not the worker producing the product. So I think that's the disconnect that everybody has in terms of this human rights labeling. Yeah, but it's a very good suggestion, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samita. Just quickly asking if there's anyone else that would like to ask a question, and I can unmute. If not, I have a question for John. Or anyone who would like to add on, of course, is more than welcome to. In your experience, how would you like to see multinational companies or corporations engage more with this NCP process?
The first thing would be awareness of it, and some of the bigger operators are, because in some ways you really don't want it to be a complaint. That's not the best way to deal with something, that there has been an impact, someone's concerned about that, they haven't been able to address it any other way, and so it's a complaint to the NCP, to the national contact point. As I said earlier, there's a lot of encouragement. Companies should have their own grievance mechanism. So to be aware of what the guidelines expect, how they're understood by national contact points, and have that informing what the company is putting in place itself in its own procedures and policies. Because there have been a few cases that have come through to contact points where the company's been able to explain, look, this is what we have in place to deal with this issue, and if that meets the guidelines, then that's all that the contact point is looking at, consistency with the guidelines. So it's awareness, and it's building those, which gets back to the UN guiding principles, issues of effective grievance mechanisms. Now, whether that's the company's own process, whether it's perhaps in the context they're working in, if there is a very strong legally supported enforcement mechanism that provides those protections, then the company's able to rely on that. If that's not the case, the company needs to do more itself, and the final result, if it doesn't, is the potential of a complaint to a contact point.
Thank you so much, John. So my next question is sort of directed towards everyone. And of course, if there's any other questions in the meanwhile, I will, of course, ask them as well. And it's a couple of questions wrapped up in one. So looking down the line and towards a hopeful future, how would you like to see the NCP process grow? And do you think there'll be any mandatory reporting for multinational corporations? And how will that assist those at the front line who are directly affected?
I think
John,
with the
I can take
NCP
you off
bit.
the hook if you like.
Oh, thank you. Yes,
Be brave enough to
please.
go first every time, so I'll give you some more thinking time. I just did jot down a bit of your question. Let me double check it. Oh, right. Yeah, I guess from our perspective, I guess looking at the AusNCP, I don't have purview like John does as to how it's all operating globally. I think certainly if I look at business awareness of the OECD guidelines in Australia, I would say that there's less maturity or confidence in talking to the OECD guidelines compared to something like the UN guiding principles. And whilst they're very similar in nature, I think, as John pointed out in one of his earlier slides, there's quite a lot more detail and sector-specific detail and guidance already that exists in different OECD materials. So would love to see more of that conversation in Australia, either through Treasury where the AusNCP sits, in coordination with our office or whatever that might look like. So it's probably a task, even one that we can think about taking up. In terms of law or legislation on multinational companies, as I mentioned, Australia is going into this period of reform on the Modern Slavery Act, where the government has committed and will consult on the potential for this due diligence obligation in the Modern Slavery Act. So if that's something you all think will be effective, I really encourage you to get behind that consultation process, because what we don't often see in consultation processes in Australia is voices from the region. Sumita and her work, Migrant Forum Asia, they're the ones that will deal with the companies who are trying to do the due diligence in Malaysia or in Nepal or in Indonesia, where Samuel's from. So your input into how you think this will play out for you, I think could be a really important value add. What I hope, and I suppose the theory of once these things are legislated, is that it centers companies' efforts, it gives resource to that effort, it gives guidance and specific instruction to that effort, which in turn is designed to have a better outcome for some of the most vulnerable workers. And your experience is really the yardstick and the measure of if that is a successful outcome. Certainly, it is the intent. So, yeah, I guess in terms of legislation change in Australia for multinationals, the time is now until, over the next coming months, once we see the formal consultation paper. So if you, keen for everyone to get involved if you think it's going to make a change.
Let me just echo what Laura mentioned. As frontliners, I think that's what she mentioned. It's very important for frontliners to be in the conversation, having to work on the ground and also bringing the voice of the workers and the reality on the ground. So I think that's important for the process as well. So the NCP definitely is welcomed. And then we would like to see more progressive, guidelines, things that can help the company do better. And for me, like what I said just now, it's always a win-win situation. We also look at the company side. We want the company to thrive. We also want the workers' rights to be protected, so that it'll be a win-win situation for everyone. So that should be the goal, in all honesty. And also whether mandatory reporting, I think that it really depends, because we have seen a lot of companies taking a lot of effort to do reporting, but then it doesn't really translate to what's on the ground. Or even it's a void of the involvement of workers, or void of involvement of trade unions. So then that defeats the purpose. So you can have mandatory reporting, but it must be something that is reality on the ground, that it shows what's happening in the company itself. So let's see how this goes. I think it's a welcome move, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumita. John, did you have any comments? Otherwise, we've just got another question in the chat box, which I'm happy to ask to the panel if anyone would like to comment on that.
Happy to go to the chat box. Here we go. I'm just looking at it now. A risk.
It's
I guess that risk is an interesting thing to look at, and this is well picked up in the guidelines. And often companies will say, look, there is just so much. I have my first tier suppliers, they have other suppliers. There is so much, I cannot possibly know everything that goes on in relation to every product that ends up with me. And the guidelines understand you that of course is not possible to see, but the question is, have you at least done that risk assessment to work out, well, where are the most serious ones coming up, and have you then got an informed assessment of what it is you're concentrating on? The fact that you may not know your third tier supplier. There's an impact occurring directly there, provided you've for the resources you've got and the decision making you've got, you can show, well, look, we saw these as the priorities, and that's what we're working on. The guidelines can accept that, and so one of the cases where I said the company was found compliant, it was an investor that explained the action that they did and the priorities that they did, and the guidelines said that was acceptable. So yeah, risk is a good thing to look at in the guidelines and how they deal with that. And just very quickly on the future regulation of this, I don't think we're not going to see anywhere the guidelines themselves become mandatory, but we'll see parts of it as we do with the UN Guiding Principles. So whether it's about, say, critical minerals, whether it's modern slavery reporting, whether it's tailings dams, there's areas of this where they'll say, okay, that process or that bit of due diligence is now a mandatory requirement in this country.
Thank you so much, John. And I guess this is like a good point to wrap up on as well. Positive note. Thank you so much, John, Laura, and Samitha, for your contributions today. And thank you to everyone who joined us as well. Our next webinar in this series will be held on the 29th of October, and we'll be sending out information for that shortly in the coming weeks. We'll also be sending out a short feedback form. If you have 2 minutes time, that would be greatly appreciated by the DTP. We'll of course also be sharing the links and the presentations, and we will let you know if we are able to share the recording as well. So thank you again for attending today, and I look forward to seeing you on the 29th of October.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.